Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. Thank you so much for your patience with me. I know it's been several months since I've posted a video. I finally finished school about a month ago, so thanks for your understanding. These videos take a really long time to put together. The YouTubers that you see who put out videos every week usually have a whole team of people working for them, so they have somebody doing research or maybe even multiple people doing research, and they have editors and all these other people doing things. I'm not sure what they're doing, but they have a whole staff, and I am just a one-woman show. But thank you so much for all the encouragement and especially the comments telling me to keep going. It's very motivating for me, so I really appreciate it. So today we're going to be talking about the disappearance of a young American man named David Lewis Sneddon, who disappeared on August 14th, 2004 in China. It's a very complicated case. It's probably going to be my longest video yet, but it's really important. There are a lot of misconceptions about this case that I want to clear up. I did a lot of research on it, and there are a lot of facts that just aren't getting out there into the public perception of this case. But just before we get started, if you have been watching my channel and enjoying it, if you could please subscribe, it would really help me out a lot. Thank you so much. So the popular one paragraph version of this story goes like this. There was a Mormon kid on his mission in China. And one day he went out for a hike and he just never came back. And he most likely just had a hiking accident and died, but they never found his body. And his family just couldn't accept that this happened. So in their grief, they made up this wild story about how he must have been kidnapped by North Korea, which is just totally ridiculous. Now, the thing about this version I just gave you is nothing I just said is true at all. This is a wild story. It's not that simple. And I could not believe I had not heard of this case until like 6 months ago. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell the whole story to clear up all the confusion that's out there about it. David Lewis Sneddon was born on May 3rd, 1980 in Nebraska. He was born into a Mormon family, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And my understanding is that they prefer the term Latter-day Saints, and usually it's abbreviated as LDS, so I'm going to refer to them as LDS. David's parents, Kathleen and Roy, had met as undergraduate students at Utah State University. They got married, they went on to have 11 children. David was number 10. And they were both professors at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln for over 40 years. David's parents would later become missionaries in the Congo, but now they're retired and living in Utah. The whole family is very close, and David especially is known for being very likable and having a whole multitude of talents. So first of all, David was an Eagle Scout. And if you don't know what that is, it's the highest rank in this organization called the Boy Scouts of America. Basically, it's just a youth development organization, and they do a lot of different things, but one thing they focus on is a lot of outdoorsy kind of stuff, like outdoor skills, how to survive in the wilderness, how to be prepared for anything kind of deal. And in fact, David's entire family were all into the outdoors because they all went hiking at this place called Wind River Mountain Range in Wyoming. And for David, that started when he was 8 years old. He also helped his father build their new house in 2002, and that allowed them to get very close. David was very involved in musicals and sports in high school. First of all, he was in something called the swing choir, and he also ran cross country. In fact, he won an award at school for being the most improved cross-country runner. And let me tell you how he did this, because it's pretty hardcore. So over the summers, David would work as a maintenance person for the city parks in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so he was outside all day doing manual labor basically. And then he would spend his evenings running. That's how he became the most improved cross country runner, which is much more than I can say for my own athletic inclinations in high school. David graduated from high school when he was 17 in 1997, and he went on to attend BYU, which is Brigham Young University. BYU is a huge private university that's owned by the LDS Church. And it's a great place to be if you're a member of the church because you can go to school there, you can meet all kinds of other LDS members, maybe even find your future spouse. It just gives you the whole college experience, but within the LDS context. In 1999, when he was 19 years old, David decided to go on his mission trip, which is basically where young LDS members go to another country and they spread their religion. And he ended up going to Seoul, South Korea. And not only did he fall in love with the people of South Korea, but he was also very good at learning Korean. So he learned it very quickly, he became fluent, and he ended up being a trainer for the other missionaries there. So his Korean was excellent. So after this wonderful experience of going to South Korea and learning Korean, David decided he wanted to learn Chinese too. So after 2 years of living in Seoul, he went back to BYU to continue studying for his Asian languages degree. So he was going to graduate from BYU with a major in Chinese and business and a minor in Korean. David's older brother Michael had a company called Multiling, and it was a business language translation company. And in the summer of 2003, David worked full-time for this company researching the South Korean market. Then in fall 2003, David moved into Chinese House on BYU's campus. At BYU, they have these different language houses, so it's not just Chinese, they also have Spanish and other ones. But the whole idea is you're going to be immersed in the Chinese language. So the resident assistant is an actual native Chinese speaker, and everyone you're living with is also trying to learn Chinese at the same time. So it's a way to have an immersive language experience without actually leaving campus. And David did very well with this. He learned Chinese pretty well. I don't think he was quite as fluent as he was in Korean, but he definitely spoke Mandarin pretty well too. So after learning Korean and Chinese, David decided that he would also like to learn Spanish. So he also put a down payment on a room at Spanish House for the fall of 2004. So he could add Spanish to his arsenal as well. So in the summer of 2004, David decided he wanted to go to China to practice his Mandarin. And he was also going to get some school credits there so that he could finish his degree on time. He was initially supposed to go on a study abroad trip to Nanjing, but that trip got canceled because of the SARS virus. You may or may not remember this, but there was a predecessor to COVID, and it was called SARS. And I believe it had a much higher mortality rate than COVID. So it was kind of a big deal. So they canceled this Nanjing study abroad, but David decided he wanted to go anyway. So he ended up enrolling at Beijing University of International Relations. And he arrived in Beijing in April 2004 and started his summer classes. I want to point out right now that this trip to China was not about proselytizing his religion. That's actually illegal in China, and David was not doing that at all. This was purely for educational purposes. So while he was in Beijing, David emailed his parents 2 to 3 times a week. Like I said, the whole family was very close, and David kept in regular contact. He was excited to be there in China, but he also sounded like he was looking forward to coming home too. While he was in Beijing, David had a roommate named George Bailey, who was another BYU student that he had met at the beginning of the 2003-2004 school year. And so George and David got to know each other very well over this time. George has given interviews about this case, and he said that David was a super chill guy, really easy to get along with, really good man, just overall a great guy, and they never really argued. George was also a really nice guy because David asked him to bring him some material so he could study Spanish over the summer too, which I think is kind of a lot of pressure for someone, to be studying abroad in China, trying to work on your Mandarin, and also trying to work on Spanish. That's kind of a lot. But George did that for David, which was really nice. He also talked about how David was looking forward to getting back to BYU so that he could start dating some of the young women there. Because, like I said, a lot of times people at BYU end up meeting their future spouse. Another thing that George mentioned was that David was in regular contact with one of his BYU professors, one of his Mandarin professors, over a grade. David felt like his grade wasn't fair, and so he was kind of having this ongoing conflict about it all summer with his professor. So while David was in China, he wanted to take some time at the end of the summer and do some hiking and kind of tourism stuff over in Western China. And he convinced George to join him, although George's flight home was earlier than David's, so he wasn't going to be able to stay for all of it. David, on the other hand, was supposed to meet his brother Michael in Seoul on August 26th. So I'm not sure how long originally George was supposed to be with David, but he kind of changed his plans about a week before they were leaving because George had studied abroad before in this province called Shandong, and he decided he wanted to see some friends there. And so, anyway, they were supposed to be together longer than they actually were. On August 5th, the two of them took most of their stuff that they had with them and they dropped it off with a friend in Beijing. And they only took what they needed for their trips, meaning like their two separate trips. And then they got on a sleeper train, which is a 27-hour overnight train, and went all the way to this city called Guilin. Meanwhile, Beijing International University sent David's parents his certificate of completion for his studies. So George's trip to this area ended up being very short because he left on August 9th. So they were basically only together August 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. But George said David was fine, he was chill and happy, and he was still happy to be going. This whole thing about them separating is kind of important because it shows that David wasn't planning on being alone for as long as he ended up being alone for. On August 11th, David emailed his parents saying that he was getting ready to take a bus to a place called Tiger Leaping Gorge, which sounds really cool. He said that he was excited, but nonetheless looking forward to coming home. So David had a whole detailed itinerary of where he was going before August 26th when he was going to fly to Seoul. And he was planning on spending 2 days, full days, in Tiger Leaping Gorge, which is a 2-day hike if you're fast. Of course, you can go and stay longer if you want to take a break, but a lot of people go for 2 days. So on August 12th and 13th, he was planning on hiking the gorge. And the trail at Tiger Leaping Gorge is called the High Trail. But sadly, David's parents never heard anything else about his trip to Tiger Leaping Gorge because that email that he sent them on August 11th was the last email that they would ever get from him. At first, they weren't that worried because they were hoping that he just didn't have internet access and that surely he would meet up with his brother as planned on August 26th in Seoul. But unfortunately, that day came and David's brother Michael had to call their mother and tell her that David never showed up. Meanwhile, George was also wondering where David was because he didn't have the address for the guy who had their stuff. So he emailed David about that, but never got a response, which was uncharacteristic of David. George ended up finding his stuff through another person and he was fine. And he too was hoping that David just didn't have internet access. So he went ahead and went home to Utah thinking that everything was fine. But the next day, David's mother, Kathleen, called George and asked him if he knew where David was. And George said that in that moment he knew something was very wrong. He, of course, didn't know where David was, and he said he knew right then that something had happened to David outside of his control, and that it was one of the worst moments of his life. So, David's parents contacted the US Embassy in China, and the embassy reported him missing to Chinese authorities. But the Sneddons didn't want to wait around for them, so they started their own investigation. And the first thing they did, of course, was look at David's bank account. And they saw that the last withdrawal had been on August 5th, when David and George were leaving Beijing, and David had taken out $300. And there was still $700 left in his account. Meanwhile, in China, the authorities began their own search for David, and they started in Quoto, which is a village near Lijiang. Quoto is where the beginning of the high trail is. They put up missing posters all over the area, and they ended up finding David's big backpack in a place called Jane's Guest House. So when they found this backpack, they gave it to the US Embassy authorities, and they inventoried it. So they found undeveloped film, clothing, and plane tickets. So David was supposed to fly on August 15th and then fly again on August 21st to visit these different regions that he wanted to see. There was a fanny pack that detached from this backpack that was missing. And so his family thought that he probably took the fanny pack only just on this 2-day hike, and he was going to come back and retrieve his big backpack when he left on August 14th. Over the next several weeks, it became clear that Chinese authorities believed that David had fallen in the Jinsha River and died. His family was quite skeptical about this because David was such a skilled outdoorsman. Like I said, he'd been hiking and doing outdoor activities since he was at least 8 years old. I also just want to point out that I tried to find reports of people who had died at Tiger Leaping Gorge. I did find one from August 2018. That was an unnamed male tourist, and they did find his body. I found posts from people saying that they had visited Tiger Leaping Gorge, and while they were there, they were told that several tourists had died there, but no specifics. And I also found several blog posts from people saying that they went to Tiger Leaping Gorge and they were expecting the trail to be much more difficult than it actually was. Regardless, the Sneddons just didn't accept this explanation so easily, and they decided they wanted to see Tiger Leaping Gorge for themselves and try to find David at the same time. So, David's father, Roy, and his two older brothers, Michael and James, decided to set off for the high trail in early September 2004. So they prepared for this trip by creating posters with David's latest school photo that said missing trekker in both Mandarin and English. And then they flew to Kunming on September 9th. And at first, US Embassy officials were great. They met them and they escorted them to the Quoto police station. They also developed the film that they had found in David's backpack, and basically they were just fun tourist pictures that David and George had taken. They eventually figured out that in his fanny pack, David had taken a toothbrush, a copy of the Book of Mormon, and his copy of Lonely Planet China. The family hired a Tibetan guide named Sean to help them. And Sean was a local. He knew everyone in the area, had a lot of connections, and he had been leading tours for over 20 years. Sean also owned a guest house there. And the family also hired an interpreter named Charlie Chen. So on September 13th, Michael, Roy, and James began hiking the high trail, going the same exact path that David had gone to try to find him, or try to figure out what had happened to him. Now, in their opinion, this trail was not that difficult and wouldn't have been that difficult for David. They really couldn't see him having an accident there, especially because there's a road between the high trail and the river. So you're up on the high trail. If you fell down, you would roll way down and end up on a road before you would end up in the river. And they just didn't feel like that was realistic. But I actually don't think that this part is nearly as important as some people make it out to be. We will revisit this later because, of course, David could have had an accident despite being a very experienced outdoorsman. All along the way, Roy, Michael, and James were asking people if they had seen a male Westerner who spoke Mandarin well. And if they said yes, they asked the person to describe his mannerisms, the time of day that they saw him, and where, and so on. And they tried their best to do this in a very scientific way. So they would rate these sightings. And remember, they had two Chinese speakers with them, so they were able to verify the accuracy of what these people were saying. They spent 6 days doing this, and they found a total of 9 people who they believe had seen David. This trip and everything the family discovered on it became the basis of an 80-page report that the Sneddons made about David's disappearance. I read the whole thing, and it is as scientific as they could have made it. It's also a little bit of a sad read, not just because of what happened, but because the family had to do this on their own. They didn't have anyone helping them. Like, they didn't have a State Department official helping them make a report that would be more likely to be taken seriously or anything. They just had to kind of wing it on their own, and I think they did an excellent job. So, they identified 4 key sightings of David. The first key sighting was from a guide who had been working with a group of tourists when David decided to join them, kind of in the middle of their hike. These tourists were Chinese, and David was speaking Mandarin with them and also teaching them a little English. This group ended up hiking with David for about 3 hours, and then they all spent the night at a place called Tina's Guest House. The second key sighting was from a woman named Miss Zhang, who owned a Korean cafe in this town called Shangri-La, and the name of this Korean cafe was Yak Bar. Now, I want to point out something really important, which is that Shangri-La is 75 miles from Tina's guest house. According to Miss Zhang, David actually stopped in Yak Bar 3 different times over a 2-day period and was conversing with her in Korean. The third key sighting was from a tour guide, also in Shangri-La, who said that he had met David in a place called Snowland Restaurant and Coffee Shop. And the fourth key sighting was from a woman who said that David had spent the night in the guest house where she was working in Shangri-La prior to when he was going to leave for Lijiang to continue on his trip. So those 4 sightings were ones that the family was sure, certain, that these people actually saw David. But there were other sightings too. And if you remember, along the high trail, there was one at Tina's guest house. Well, further along the trail from Tina's guest house is another guest house called Sean's guest house. And there was a sighting there too. And on past that, there are some more villages, one of which is called Haba. And there was another sighting of David there. Just for the sake of being as detailed as possible, I'm just going to quickly read you what David's family figured out he actually did on those days that he was in the area of Tiger Leaping Gorge. On the morning of August 11th, he left Lijiang and went to Kwoto, which is a 2.5-hour bus ride. When he got to Kwoto, he dropped off his large backpack at Jane's guest house. Then at 2 to 3 p.m., he started hiking at Tiger Leaping Gorge and probably spent 5 to 7 hours doing that. At 7 p.m., he met up with the 3 hikers and ended up going to Tina's guest house with them. At 10 p.m., they made it to Tina's guest house, and then the next day, he visited Sean's guest house, which is 2 kilometers down the trail from Tina's guest house. Around 4 p.m., he probably arrived in this place called Haba, where a shopkeeper said that he saw him. They're not sure where he spent the night, but it was somewhere around this village area of Haba. Then, on August 13th, David took a 4 to 5 hour bus ride to the city of Shangri-La, which again is 75 miles from Tina's guest house. He ended up eating at Yak Bar. Then he spent the night a block away from Yak Bar at another guest house. And then the next day, August 14th, he went to Yak Bar again, and there he told Miss Zhang around lunchtime that he was leaving. So he was going to take a bus to Kwoto, and there he was going to pick up his large backpack at Jane's guest house. And then he was going to go to Lijiang by bus, which all of that would have taken about 6 hours. And then the next day, on August 15th, he would have spent the whole day traveling from Lijiang to Kunming, where he was going to catch a flight that night. Okay, so this is the most frustrating part of this case to me, other than the fact that we don't know where David is, of course, but I just want to talk about this for a minute. So there's this whole debate online about, well, David, couldn't have died on the trail because he was such an experienced hiker. And then people respond and they say, well, of course he could have died. Experienced hikers can and do have accidents, even deadly accidents. And those people are correct. It is within the realm of possibility that David Sneddon had some kind of accident while he was hiking at Tiger Leaping Gorge and he died and they just haven't found his body yet. That is possible. But the problem with that theory is not that it couldn't have happened because, he was so experienced. The problem with the theory is the logistics. So, like I said, David was seen in this place called Haba, which is a 4-hour bus ride from Shangri-La, where he was also seen by 3 different people. Even if the sighting in Haba was incorrect, if he had gone from David's guest house, or Tina's guest house actually, the bus from Tina's guest house to Shangri-La is 2.5 hours. So it is not the case that David went on this hike and 5 seconds off the hike he just disappeared, or disappeared while he was hiking. He is known to have been in Shangri-La hours away from the high trail. So that means that if he drowned in the river, he would have had to go back on at least a 2.5-hour bus ride and go back on the trail that he had just completed and then drowned. Or I guess the other explanation is that all these people who said they saw him were lying. But I just don't think that's true. It really seems to me that he did make it through the high trail and onto Shangri-La. Now, since the last place David was seen was at Yak Bar, and he told Miss Zhang that he was leaving, but he never made it to Jane's guest house to pick up his backpack, it seems that something happened after lunch on August 14th, but before he was able to get to Jane's guest house. And the Sneddons did a great job covering all their bases here. They talked to local authorities, they called every hospital, every mental hospital, thinking maybe David had had some kind of psychological breakdown, but he wasn't in any hospital. They talked to locals, they tried to figure out if maybe he could have been murdered, but everyone told them that that was very unlikely. It's a very safe area, and they felt that way too, because while they were looking for David on the high trail, everyone was super nice and friendly, and they just couldn't picture that happening. Now, of course, it's possible that David ran off because he wanted to start a new life. But there are just so many little factors that don't make sense with this theory. Like the fact that he'd already taken out a student loan for his next year at BYU. He'd already put a deposit down at Spanish House. He'd already scheduled his LSAT, which, if you don't know what the LSAT is, it's just a test to get into law school, which is what David was planning on doing when he graduated from BYU. Not to mention, he still had that $700, so you'd think maybe he would have wanted to take that when starting his new life. And also, the fact that he already had this job with Multiling, so why would he want to give that up? There was just no indication at all that David wanted to start a new life. It sounded to me like David wanted to go back to BYU, meet a new girlfriend, marry her, and have a family life. The Sneddon's report that I mentioned earlier concludes that David must have been noticed because of his unusual language skills and taken against his will by some organization. The fact that he was traveling alone and spoke both Korean and Mandarin would have been very noticeable. And actually, the Sneddons were thinking that he was being held in detention in China. They may well have been right about his being held in detention, but maybe wrong about the country. But for the next 6.5 years, there was basically no more movement on David's case. The family never heard from him, and they had no idea what happened to him, which is just heartbreaking. I just can't imagine what that must have been like for them. But in April 2011, Kathleen Sneddon, David's mother, got a call from someone named Chuck Downs. Chuck was the executive director for the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. And he told Kathleen that he believed David was being held there. Let's switch topics for a minute and talk about North Korea. North Korea is a country that occupies the northern half of the Korean peninsula. It has a population of about 25 million people, and it's about the size of the state of Pennsylvania. But here's the thing about North Korea. It's not a normal country at all. In fact, some people say that North Korea is closer to a cult of personality than a country. And that personality is the Kim family, who have ruled North Korea since 1948. You may have heard of Kim Jong-un or seen him on the news. He's the current supreme leader of North Korea, and he's always talking about his nuclear weapons. He's known for his very interesting haircut. But anyway, he is the third person in the Kim dynasty to rule over North Korea. His father was Kim Jong-il, who ruled from 1994 until his death in 2011. And his father was Kim Il-sung, who is considered North Korea's founding father, and who was its supreme leader from 1972 until his death in 1994. From the late 14th century through the early 19th century, Korea was ruled by the Joseon dynasty. And after that, it was taken over by Japan, who ruled the peninsula until they surrendered at the end of World War II. Just like in Germany, the Korean peninsula was divided into roughly half, with the northern half being ruled by the Soviet Union and the southern half being ruled by the United States. In 1948, the countries officially became separated, and that's what led to there being North Korea and South Korea. And in 1950, the North invaded the South, which was the beginning of the Korean War. The Korean War went on for 3 years, and it was a horrible, bloody conflict with lots and lots of casualties, civilian deaths, cities destroyed, and it was all basically for no reason, because at the end of the war, there was very little territory change, and the two countries were still separate. Actually, I shouldn't refer to the end of the war, because technically it's still going on, because technically it ended in a stalemate. Although in 2018, there were efforts from both sides to create a treaty that would formally end the war. Kim Il-sung, the founder of the nation, was basically the one who decided to separate somewhat from the Soviet Union and develop his own ideology, which is called Juche. Juche is all about self-reliance. Basically, the country doesn't want to have to depend on any other country for anything. Kim Il-sung himself was apparently quite charismatic. He had a very warm smile, and people really liked him. He just had kind of a magnetic personality. This adoration from the North Korean public has now been exploited for political purposes. Basically one political purpose, which is to keep the Kim dynasty as rulers of North Korea, absolute rulers. And that's how North Korea became a cult of personality. Basically, it's an imperial cult where people actually think that the Kim family are gods or semi-gods. For example, there are interviews with North Korean defectors who say things like they didn't even believe that the Kims used the toilet. Daily life for most people in North Korea is not very good. So, first of all, their economy is terrible, and people are living in poverty. And they also don't have enough food. So, most people, or at least it seems that most people, or a large portion of people, are malnourished. Because remember, they have this thing about juche, and the Kim family thinks that they should be able to grow all their own food and fertilizer, but they can't. So people are starving. And on top of that, there are electricity shortages, and there's no internet access for most people. Like the vast majority of people in North Korea have never been online. They don't know anything about the outside world because the Kim family wants to censor everything and make sure they don't start rising up against them. On top of that, of course, people don't get to choose their jobs. The government chooses for them. And 37% of people end up being farmers. The job of a farmer in North Korea is very, very difficult. They don't have proper equipment. They're doing a lot of very difficult manual labor, toiling in the fields, just like it were 100 years plus ago. And it's just not a very good life. On top of all of that, North Korea is basically a mass surveillance state. So the Kim family has always been very paranoid because, of course, they don't want to lose power. And so they are constantly on the lookout for anyone who might have opinions that are contrary to the Kim family's interests. So if you complain about anything or if you express some sort of view, especially of Kim Jong un or either of his predecessors, basically your neighbors can tell on you. And when that happens, normally you get sent to a police station where they torture you until you confess to being disloyal to the Kim regime. And then they often send not only you, but 3 generations of your family to a prison camp. And when I say a prison camp, this is a gulag, like a Soviet style death camp. These prisons are probably the most grim places on earth. It is horrible. There are lots of documentaries about them on YouTube. I don't want to go into detail because it's just awful. But basically, some of these prisons are actual death camps where they know that 20 to 25% of the prison population is going to die each year. And so basically, they're death camps. Just to give one example, people often get frostbite because they're sent to go work outside in the fields when it's freezing, below freezing, wearing only rags. It's really, really horrifying and maybe one of the saddest things that has ever happened on Earth. So, just to warn you if you do go looking for information about it. So, as a result of all of this, people act like they just love the Kim family and they have to cry on the anniversaries of their deaths and so on and so forth. There are lots of videos about that too. But the $1,000,000 question is, do people actually believe this about the Kim regime? Do they actually worship them and think their lives are amazing? Or are they just saying that because they know they have to? Because if they don't, they're going to be sent to a prison camp along with their family. Nobody really knows. As you can imagine, lots of people are very desperate to leave North Korea. And so there must be some doubt in the minds of some of them. I read that in the South, the idea of defecting or leaving the country, which is super illegal, by the way, isn't really very well known. But in the North, North Korea shares borders with China and Russia. And so there's a little bit more outside information coming in. And people tend to know a little bit more about what the outside world is like, and they might feel inclined to try to escape. If you want to escape North Korea, it's quite difficult. First of all, it's not like there's free movement all over the country. You're pretty much confined within your province. There are checkpoints all over the country to make sure people aren't moving around. If you just so happen to live up north, though, you may be able to escape through Russia or China. So, first of all, the border with Russia is very short. It's only 11 miles long, and most people do not go through Russia, mostly because there actually isn't already a network of North Koreans or Korean people who can help them. But across the border with China, there is such a network, and it actually is possible to escape, even though there are shoot to kill orders for anyone seen crossing the border. But the border is over 800 miles long, and so they can't police every square inch of it all the time. So people can and do escape North Korea through China. It does happen. You may be wondering what in the world any of this has to do with David Sneddon. So let me explain. In July 2004, which was just a month before David went missing, a record 468 people fled North Korea. They actually escaped to Vietnam, and Vietnam ended up sending them to South Korea, where they could maybe get citizenship and resettle and have a new life. But at least some of them escaped through Yunnan Province, which is where David was. Now, let me explain why they go all the way to Yunnan Province. Because another common argument about David's case is that why in the world would North Korea kidnap him all the way far away in Yunnan Province? It's too far and it doesn't make sense. So if you escape North Korea into China and China catches you, they consider you an illegal economic immigrant and they send you back to North Korea. And guess what happens when you get there? It's not good. So for that reason, people are trying to get to another country past China. In fact, the main country that North Korean escapees want to get to usually is Thailand. And so in Yunnan Province, that's kind of the very south of China, and it has all these train networks with the Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. And so people will go through Yunnan Province, get on a train, get across the border with Thailand, for example, and immediately just surrender to the police there. And usually what happens is the Thai government deports them to South Korea. As a side note, China didn't used to treat defectors like this, but in the 90s, there was this horrible famine in North Korea. And people started escaping like crazy, and so China felt like they needed to do something about it. This famine was so bad, it happened between 1994 and 98. And the worst year was 1997. Government rations for food per person per day was down to just half a cup. That's how much food people were getting in 1997 in North Korea. So you can imagine why people were escaping through China. So as you can imagine, 468 people escaping North Korea was not really something that the North Korean government was a big fan of. And so that very month, as soon as they realized what happened, they started putting more agents right there in Yunnan Province to try to prevent this from happening again. China and North Korea are allies, and it's known that China allows North Korean operatives to conduct activities there. So back to the United States for just a minute. There was a young LDS attorney named Nick Kraft who was interviewing for a job at the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Remember Chuck Downs? That's his organization. And when Nick was interviewing for this job, he asked Chuck if Chuck thought that maybe David could have been kidnapped by North Korea. And Chuck had never heard of David's case. Nick had been a missionary in Seoul after David was, which is how he knew a lot of the story. And when Chuck heard the details of this story, he became convinced that that was exactly where David was. Because you see, in addition to all the other human rights abuses that I just mentioned about North Korea, another thing that they like to do is go around the world kidnapping people. They have kidnapped people from at least 12 different countries. I know that if you've never heard about this, it may sound totally wild and crazy, but it is documented and known that North Korean agents go around kidnapping people, and they've been doing this since the Korean War. Because Kim Il sung really wanted to have some South Korean professionals come to the North and start working for him to rebuild their country. He was also trying to create a brain drain in South Korea so that they would become more communist and maybe merge back with the North. Eventually, this practice went beyond South Korea, and agents started kidnapping people from other countries to steal their identities, to force them to work for the North Korean government, training spies in their own language and culture. They sometimes wanted to use them for other skills that they had. Sometimes they wanted to brainwash them and turn them against their home country, or even just serve as spouses for other people that they had kidnapped. The country where North Korea has kidnapped the greatest number of people outside of South Korea is actually Japan. North Korean agents started going into Japan in the late 1970s and kidnapping people there right off the coasts. They would go in little fishing boats and just snatch people. Usually they were people in their 20s. And those people just randomly disappeared out of nowhere in Japan, and their families had no idea what happened to them. For years, the idea of North Korea kidnapping these people was considered like a conspiracy theory in Japan. But eventually, the theory began to be taken seriously. And in 1998, an organization was formed called NARCAN, the National Association for the Rescue of Japanese Kidnapped by North Korea. And then in 2002, one of the most bizarre things that has ever happened in international relations happened in North Korea. If you remember, around this time, North Korea was still coming out of this famine that they were in, and they were really desperate for money and super desperate to have normalized relations with other countries again. So they set up some talks with Japan. And as a goodwill gesture, Kim Jong-il actually admitted to the Prime Minister of Japan that North Korea had kidnapped 13 Japanese citizens. He apologized and said that his forces had gotten carried away with a quest for glory. North Korea said that 5 of these abductees were still alive, but 8 had died under strange circumstances. On October 15th, 2002, North Korea actually sent the 5 people from Japan that they had admitted to kidnapping back to Japan. And they were supposed to just stay there for 2 weeks. But when they arrived, the Japanese public was completely outraged that the government was going to send these people who had finally escaped from North Korea back to North Korea. And so Japan didn't end up sending them back, and the whole deal kind of fell apart because North Korea considered Japan not sending them back to be a violation of their agreement. Unfortunately, because North Korea didn't end up getting anything out of all of this, it's less likely that they'll admit to any kidnappings in the future. I know all of this sounds a little crazy, but this really did happen. You can just Google it and read all about it. This is a real thing that actually happened in 2002. There are 17 people that the Japanese government recognizes as having been kidnapped by North Korea, but there may have been hundreds more. Now, back to David. His family in 2011 found out that there was this theory about him being held in North Korea. The next year, in May 2012, one of the chairmen of NARCAN, Tsutomu Nishioka, released a report that he had gotten from an informant inside China. This is a Chinese security report. And it says that in August 2004, a white American who was a student at Kunming University, who was 23 or 24 years old, was arrested by the Ministry of State Security on charges of helping illegal immigrants. He was released in September 2004 because Jace, Jais, was coming to look for him. But his quote, Chinese girlfriend said that he was handed over to 5 North Korean agents who had come to Kunming for surveillance of defectors. Of course, there are two problems with this report in relation to David. First of all, that he was not a student at Kunming University, and secondly, that he didn't have a Chinese girlfriend. But overall, the description sounds like it could be David. And there's no one else fitting that description that's known to have had any sort of story that's similar to that at all, or is missing from China. It's not like there are all these people missing from China who fit that description, and, David's just one of many of them. David's literally the only person, the only American to have gone missing in China since, like, the end of World War II. George Bailey did an interview where he said that maybe David got detained, and as they were interrogating him, he mentioned that he had been a missionary in South Korea, and that would have made them even more suspicious of his presence in China, because remember, proselytizing in China is illegal. If David was handed over to North Korean agents, it may have been in relation to a bribe. So bribery is really common in China, and the agents could have bribed whoever was holding David in order to let him be released to them instead of released back out into the public. I'm not saying that this would have been easy to do, it wouldn't have been, but if China were holding David for 2 to 4 plus weeks, so we don't know exactly when he was released in September, that would have given North Korean agents, some time to come up with a plan of how they were going to smuggle him out of China and into North Korea. You may be wondering why they would want to do that, and that's a great question. So again in July 2004, an American man who had been living in North Korea for 40 years, named Charles Jenkins, was released. The reason this matters for David's case is that Charles Jenkins had been teaching English to North Korean spies, and he was one of the only native English speakers and teachers in the whole country. Charles had actually defected to North Korea during the Korean War because he thought he was going to be sent to Vietnam. And he thought that if he defected to North Korea, they would just send him to the Soviet Union, and then there would be a prisoner exchange, and basically he would get to go home. But that wasn't what happened because North Korea really wanted to keep him for his English skills. Charles Jenkins had basically had an arranged marriage with one of the Japanese abductees whose name was Hitomi Soga. She had been abducted with her mother and made to serve as a translator. In 2002, Hitomi was released to go home, and then in 2004, they let Charles go. So basically, just a month before David went missing, North Korea had a new need for a replacement English teacher. Another little tidbit about this is that Charles Jenkins was from North Carolina, and he had a very pronounced American Southern drawl, whereas David did not. David had what would be considered a very standard Midwestern accent. I read that someone went to this conference in Germany where there were North Koreans, and just a couple of years after 2004, the North Koreans had gone from basically having an American Southern accent to having a more standard Midwestern accent like what David had. I want to point out just how secretive North Korea is with an example that has to do with Charles Jenkins. So when Charles Jenkins was released, he went to Japan to be with his wife, Hitomi Soga. And he became like a celebrity there. And he would give interviews on TV about his time in captivity in North Korea and how awful it was. And one day he was giving an interview and he had this picture of this woman. And this woman was a friend of his that he had had while he was in North Korea. So somebody who was watching this interview realized that this picture that Charles Jenkins was holding was of his sister, Anocha Panjoy. Anocha was a Thai national who had gone to live in Macau, which is part of China, after high school. And she disappeared from there, and her family never found out what happened to her. She disappeared in May 1978, and her brother didn't find out what had happened to her until 2005 when Charles was giving this interview. By the way, Macau is pretty far from North Korea, too. But North Korea is known to have kidnapped people from Italy and Lebanon, which are both much further away than Yunnan Province. So here's another piece of circumstantial evidence that has to do with David. There's an organization kind of like Narcan, but in South Korea instead of Japan, and it's called Kwafu. And in September 2016, one of the leaders of Kwafu, Choi Sun-young, told Japanese reporters that he had received information from inside North Korea, not inside China, but actually inside North Korea, that David was living in Pyongyang, and he was married with 2 children and working as the English tutor for Kim Jong-un himself. According to this informant, David's Korean name in North Korea is Yoon Bong-soo, and his wife's name is Kim Yoon-hae. According to this report, David and his wife have 2 children, a boy and a girl. It makes sense that David would be married with children, because if he tries to pull anything, like tries to escape or tries to contact his family or tell the media what's going on somehow, not only is he going to get punished if he gets caught, but they are too. And so North Korea could have easily set this up to deter him from trying to do any of that. Also, according to this informant, David was taken at the direction of Kim Jong-il to find a native English speaker who could also teach his son Kim Jong-un about American culture. And remember, in 2004, Kim Jong-il was still the supreme leader. He didn't die until 2011. This organization in South Korea, Kwafu, considers this informant to be very credible, because this informant is the same one who identified the husband of one of the Japanese abductees, whose name was Megumi Yokota. As of today, that intelligence from September 2016 is the last thing we've heard about David. So it seems that there are basically 4 possibilities regarding what may have happened to David. The first one is suicide, and there's just no evidence that David was in any way suicidal. He seemed happy, he was communicating with his family, he had lots of plans for the future, and he just didn't seem to be in any way suicidal. I don't think anyone believes that theory. It's technically possible, but I think it can be ruled out pretty easily. The second theory would be that David ran away to start a new life, and I don't think that one fits very well either, for all the same reasons. I mean, David had a pretty nice life. He was going to graduate from BYU, he was going to go to law school, he was going to work at least part-time for his brother's company. He wanted to get back to BYU so that he could start dating the women there and probably find a wife. He just had lots of plans for the future, and there wasn't really anything for him to run away from. So it's possible, but I don't think it's that likely. And then there's the hiking accident theory, which of course is the official theory of the Chinese government, which we've already talked about in detail. The whole problem with that one, in my opinion, is the bus ride. You know, it would be one thing if he stepped out of Tina's guest house and was never seen again, or stepped out of Haba or Sean's guest house anywhere along the high trail and just disappeared and was never seen again. That would seem to be a likely theory. But because of all these sightings in Shangri-La, 75 miles away, I just don't believe that one. And that leaves the fourth theory, which is that David was kidnapped by North Korea and is living there, basically as a slave, teaching English to Kim Jong-un. Or maybe they put him on a different assignment, who knows. There is the whole question of, if he is in North Korea, how exactly did this happen? I have a couple of theories that are just my own speculation. Well, remember how David was hanging out at Yak Bar? It's possible that those North Korean agents, who we believe to have been there in greater numbers around that time, were also in Yak Bar. And maybe they noticed that there was this kind of American kid who was fluent in Korean and obviously fluent in English and also pretty fluent in Mandarin, and he was very noticeable. And maybe they overheard him talking to Miss Zhang about how he learned Korean as a missionary, which could have been a pretext for them to tell the authorities that David may have been involved in illegal activity there in China, which could have led to his arrest. Again, that's just my own theory. Another possibility is that maybe he ran into some North Koreans and he was trying to help them, give them directions or something, without realizing all this political situation that was going on around him. And maybe the agents overheard this, and then that was the excuse to have him arrested. I mean, that could have even been a trap set by North Korean agents to try to catch people who were helping these defectors along the North Korean Underground Railroad. I think I forgot to talk about this earlier, but there is a whole big network of people all throughout China, but especially in Yunnan Province, who help North Korean defectors get through China and get onto another country that'll send them to South Korea instead. And if this actually did happen to David, just as we don't know exactly how he got arrested, we also don't know how exactly he got to North Korea. But his brother James gave an interview in 2020 that was really interesting. First of all, James has become completely fluent in Japanese, lived in Japan, and become very familiar with Japanese culture. I think that he felt a strong connection to this group of people whose relatives had been kidnapped in Japan, and so that led him to feeling this really strong connection with the country and learning all about it. But James pointed out that just like there are lots of people trying to help North Korean defectors, there are also people taking advantage of them and basically trafficking them. There's a lot of human trafficking of North Koreans that goes on in China too. And those people may have known exactly how to get David out of China and into North Korea. There was a resolution passed by both houses of Congress in the United States, basically saying that they would use all of their resources to try to figure out what happened to David, but basically nothing has happened. One really sad thing is that in 2017, the State Department, under the direction of President Trump, successfully negotiated the release of Otto Warmbier. If you don't know the story of Otto Warmbier, it's a very, very sad story. He was a student at the University of Virginia, and he went on a trip to North Korea and supposedly stole a poster. We don't know that he really did that. He was arrested in North Korea, put on trial, and sentenced to hard labor, but something happened to him medically, and the government ended up releasing him, and he was allowed to come home to the US. He was from the Cincinnati area. But when they released him, he was in a coma, and he died shortly after coming back home. There are several really good videos about his story, but at the same time that that was happening, the Sneddons were hoping that President Trump might be able to intervene and try to bring David home too. But that didn't end up happening. David seems like such a likable person, and if he is in North Korea, I'm sure they really don't want to let him go. David's parents are in their late 80s now, and David's mom gave an interview in 2017 in which she said, "I just want to run up to David, give him a hug, and get to know his wife and children." David always signed his emails to his mother, "Love, David." James has said that it would be easier for the family to accept that David had died versus having been kidnapped in North Korea. And over the years, their family's message has evolved to being really about the broader picture of the lack of human rights, complete lack of human rights in North Korea, and how David's story, if he is there, is just emblematic of that entire struggle that affects 25 million people in the country. David's brother James said something really profound in that 2020 interview that I mentioned. The question was, what would you tell North Korean leadership if you could tell them anything? And his response was that North Korea should let their people be free and able to innovate on their own. And then the leadership would have the strong country that they're seeking and be able to stand on the world stage with them instead of being this pariah state. And if they were willing to do that, they wouldn't even need to do things like kidnap people from other countries and kidnap his brother to teach English, because the North Korean people on their own, if they were supported by their government, would be learning all of those skills for themselves. I'm paraphrasing a bit there, but that was the general gist of his message. He said, don't be afraid to unleash the human power of your citizens. Don't be afraid to tap into their creativity, their intelligence, their innovation. Don't be afraid to set them free. That's what becomes the power behind any amazing country. David's parents and his two brothers, Michael and James, are the ones who have been the public faces of this case. But David has 8 other siblings who were all suffering too, and I think most or all of them have their own families, and they don't have their brother or their uncle, which is just awful. Michael Sneddon, of course, is still involved in the case, and he gave a speech at a conference on May 3rd, 2019, which was David's 39th birthday. And he says that the Sneddon family is praying not only for the safe return of David, but for all 25 million North Korean citizens who have to suffer under the Kim regime every day. The Sneddon family has been dealing with the loss of their son and brother for over 18 years now, and I cannot imagine what that's like. And what makes it worse is that sometimes they're treated like they're these crazy people who made up this outlandish theory. But that's just not true. There are plenty of legitimate reasons to believe that David Sneddon may be in North Korea. If you don't believe that North Korea kidnapped David Sneddon, that's fine. Of course, we don't have definitive proof that that's what happened. But this idea that David was kidnapped by North Korea wasn't even their idea in the first place. And no matter what happened to David, they're all victims. Of course, I want to know what you think. Do you believe the official version that David had a hiking accident and drowned in the Jensha River and his body just hasn't been found? Do you think it's possible he was kidnapped by North Korea, or is that just too outlandish of a theory for you? I'm really very interested to know what people think. You know, if this were not a known activity of the North Korean government, if no one had ever heard of anybody being kidnapped by them before, and this just came out of nowhere, I could see why that theory might be more outlandish. But given all that we know about North Korea's abduction activities, I think it's very possible that David is in North Korea, and if he is, I hope that he's found some happiness. The way Charles Jenkins describes North Korea, it just sounds like hell on earth. And I really, really hope that if David is there, he's able to have some comfort and is able to find some joy in life despite the horrible circumstances that he's been forced into. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. Stay safe out there, and I will see you next time.